So our present-day conversations about technology and our relationship with it, right, always seems to be centered around a large number of problems. You'll hear about the loss of privacy, about social media addiction, and so on. And when we have these conversations, perhaps you've noticed there seems to be a shared intuition that there's something morally wrong here, but pinning down what exactly the problem is can be pretty difficult, right? What is it exactly that makes the loss of privacy morally wrong, right? How would you talk about this? How would you begin to answer such a question? So these are difficult questions, and as is often the case, there's more than a few ways to advance the conversation. In this talk, I'll be trying to pursue one such method. I'll be talking about a lens that we can use to look at our relationship with technology, hopefully uncover where the moral issues exactly lie, and hopefully then cultivate a vocabulary to talk about these problems more incisively. So here's the claim, right? The legitimate moral issues in our relationship with technology, the ones that we really ought to take very seriously, come about when technology impinges on personal freedom. Okay, so maybe you've heard something like this before, right? In fact, it's very much a part of our common parlance to say things like, oh, that person is chained to his gadgets or is a slave to social media or something of that sort. And when we say these things, we're describing people who've had their freedom taken away from them in a very real sense. Right? So this kind of way of talking about technology is already very familiar to us. And my job then is to examine what we really mean when we say these things, what the underpinning premises of such a language might be, and how some problems might come about when you say things like this. So let's start with some conceptual clarification on the word freedom, which, as you might imagine, is a famously nebulous concept, right? Fortunately for us, we don't have to get bogged down with the metaphysics of what it is that makes us free in the world, because the kind of freedom that we're talking about in this context is much more ordinary, much more simple. So I'm talking about the freedom to do what you want to do without being compelled to do otherwise by a force external to you, right? So take the example of an app, for instance, that employs these so-called dark design patterns to keep you hooked onto it for as long as possible. So this app then takes away your freedom to do what you would have preferred to do, maybe something else more productive with your time, right? And so it's an external force that is compelling you to do something that maybe you would have preferred not to do. And that's really the kind of freedom we're talking about here. The freedom to be truly free in this sense is to be able to do what you want without being coerced or compelled or maybe even gently nudged by a force external to your internal motivations. And I hope you can see that's a pretty intuitive, ordinary sense of the term. Right? So the app is an obvious example of technology taking away this kind of freedom, but how far does this language help us, right? So let's look at what I think to be one of the most talked about issues in modern day conversations about technology. That's privacy, data privacy. So privacy is interesting because our moral intuitions seem to be a little all over the place here. On the one hand, when you hear about, for instance, data breaches, about people about how easy it is for advertisers and the like to get access to very intimate secrets about you from your digital trail, it makes you feel uncomfortable, doesn't it? Like you're somehow being morally harmed in some way. But at the same time, I think many of us are pretty comfortable giving up our personal information in return for some service or convenience, right? I'm quite happy, for example, to give up my location information to Google Maps in return for traffic information. And I think many of us think that there's no moral problem here. So, um, how do you make sense of this? Right? It seems conceptually as if there are two different kinds of data exchange, one with a moral problem and one without, right? And I think the language of freedom actually is very helpful in pulling the two apart. So in order to see how, let's look at an analogy from property rights, if you will. So let's say what does it mean to say you own an apartment in a building, right? You're really saying that in a sense, you have a freedom to decide what that apartment is used for, right? You have a freedom to decide what you're going to do with that thing you own. You might choose to rent it out and let someone else use it for a while, but minimally speaking, at the very least, you have the ability to decide, the freedom to decide what happens to that apartment. And I think something similar is happening in the Google Maps example. Uh, if I trade my information in return for a service, at least ideally, I still hold the freedom to decide what my information is used for, how it's being used, and why it's being exchanged in the first place. All these freedoms I still, at least ideally, seem to possess. But those freedoms are taken away from me if my data was stolen, right? And if it's exchanged without my consent and knowledge. And here you see the data exchange we identified with the moral problem seems to be the one where freedom is taken away, and the one without the moral problem is in the Google Maps example, seems to be where freedom in some sense is preserved. So my claim here is that this language of freedom is pretty useful in getting down to the bottom of the moral issues, very often of the time, making sense of our moral feelings that we have about technology. And I invite you to consider issues that you see around you with technology and try and reframe them with this language of freedom. I, well, I'd be interested to hear counterexamples if you have them, right? Oh, moving on, right, because there's still more ways to object. You could come back to me and say, right, that this freedom that I'm talking about, this ability to do what you want without being externally compelled, that freedom is a pipe dream. We don't have that freedom in society, do we? Simply by living in society and subjugating yourself to the laws of the city, you've given up quite a lot of your freedoms already, right? You're certainly not free to do whatever you like in modern society. And of course, that's true. But I don't think that that brings down the argument entirely. In order for it to bring down the argument entirely, this would have to be true, right? It would have to be true that it's only the case where we're totally, maximally free. That's the only morally right scenario, and everything else is morally wrong, right? Maybe this is true, but I don't think I have to defend this. Rather, I invite you to consider a much more simpler scenario, right? So I'll grant you, we only have a limited amount of freedom in this world. But if you were to take away more of it, if you were to make me less free, I still think you're doing something morally wrong, right? In fact, that's the only moral claim that I require you to accept, in a sense, in this talk, that it's morally wrong to take away someone's freedom, to make people less free than they are. And I hope you agree that this seems to be a pretty defensible, intuitive notion. So having done all of this groundwork, I'm finally in a position to state my argument semi-formally. And here it is, right? So technology often exerts an external force that compels us to act not according to our internal motivations. It makes us less free than we need to be. It is morally wrong to make people less free than they need to be, and therefore there are serious moral problems in our present-day relationship with technology. So in what remains of this talk, I'll consider what I think to be some pretty powerful objections to this view. So you've noticed by now that a lot is riding on the intuition that it's morally wrong almost categorically all of the time to take away someone's freedom, right? Is that right? So let's look at some examples inspired by the work of the Dutch philosophers Peter Paul Verbeek and Hans Achterhuis. So suppose you had a gun, right, that detected somehow that it was being pointed at an innocent person, and if it did, the trigger would auto-lock. So it wouldn't let you fire at innocent people. I'm blackboxing here the technology a little bit, bear with me. But I hope you can see that this gun, in a very real sense, has taken away your freedom, right? It's not allowing you to fire at an innocent person. But, and I really hope you share this intuition, there doesn't seem to be anything morally wrong going on here, does there? It seems like a mistake to say that, oh, because this gun has taken away my freedom, it is somehow doing me moral harm, right? So here's another example that gets at the same idea in a less extreme way. Suppose this time you had a car that could detect every time it approached a red traffic light and automatically brakes. So even if it's in the middle of the night and there's no one on the road and you're rushing somewhere, that car will not let you break that traffic light, right? It has, in a very real sense, taken away your freedom to do that. So I'm saying this because the moral consequences of you breaking a traffic light really are nowhere as severe as committing murder, right? Of course. But even so, it doesn't seem, not straightforwardly at the very least, that the car is doing something, that there's something very seriously morally wrong here, right? So what's happening? Right? How do you make sense of these intuitions? Here's one thing you could say, and I think maybe some of you caught on to this, right? You were never really free to commit that murder or to break that traffic light, because if you did, you'd be caught and punished, right? Of course. These are freedoms that you seem to have already given up when you subjugated yourself to the laws of the city. They're freedoms that you've already given up to live in society. And so, technically speaking, if you will, the technology hasn't made you any less free, has it? It hasn't taken away a freedom from you that you haven't already given up. So maybe that's how to explain our intuitions, that there's nothing wrong happening in these two scenarios. But, okay, but not quite, right? We're not quite out of the waters just yet. Suppose we lived in a society now where the state sanctions surveillance on all of its people, and the state takes a great interest in knowing every aspect of your digital and physical lives, right? So in such a society, you might imagine, in order to live in such a society, you're giving up a lot more of your freedom, aren't you? You've certainly given up the freedom to hold any information about you private. So the question now becomes, is it okay for someone to use technology in such a society to spy on you, right? Because technically that's a freedom you've already given up. Uh, More generally, right? If you give up more freedoms, is it okay for technology to impinge on this larger set of sacrificed freedoms? And here's the killer. I mean, here's why it's problematic. Should our moral analysis of technology be somehow tied to the society that we're studying? Right? That just doesn't seem right. Okay, so here's what you might come back and say. You might say, maybe there's a set of small freedoms that are fundamentally incompatible with life in society, right? There are some freedoms that we just have to give up simply in order to live with each other. And it's only these freedoms that technology is allowed, so to speak, to impinge upon. Okay, maybe that helps us, right? But what are these freedoms, right? So, so it doesn't help us very much. And I think here we come to, I think, what is such a fundamental question about life in society, right? What freedoms do we need to give up in order to live with each other? This is the kind of question that's well above me to definitively answer. So here's where I get off the train, so to speak. But I think it's interesting that this language of freedom, when pursued to its conclusion, brings us to such a fundamental, such a philosophically interesting question. But having said that, I do have to acknowledge that there exists a gray area, even despite all of the progress we've made and despite all of the many smart people have written about freedom, there are a certain set of freedoms that we're not quite sure whether we deserve to have in society. Right? Should we have the freedom to keep our private information from the hands of people who demand it in the interest of national security, right? Whatever that means. Should we have the freedom to, I don't know, say things that might be perceived by someone else as mean-spirited and bigoted, because that's still freedom of speech, for instance? I mean, we have these fights all the time, right? And you might have very strong opinions about them, but I think quite reasonably an argument can be mounted on either side. And so there does seem to be this gray area of freedoms that we're not quite sure how to categorize. That being said, I'm not quite sure that the existence of this gray area undermines everything I've said so far. I think that in a great many cases, it is fairly straightforward to categorize the freedom at hand into one of these two categories, especially when we're talking about problems like moral problems in technology around us. It's fairly straightforward, for instance, to say that we need to give up the freedom to commit murder, indiscriminately murder each other, right? Of course, we have to give up that freedom if we want to live in society. It's also fairly straightforward that we ought to preserve the freedom to withhold our private information from those personalized advertisers, right? Why should we give that up in order to live in society? I think when we're analyzing moral problems around us with technology, very often it's more straightforward it's pretty straightforward to categorize the freedom at hand into one of these two categories. And when that happens, the language of freedom does help us get down to the bottom of the moral issue, at least help us understand a little better what the moral issue really is. And so that's my case. You might disagree. I think there are a few ways for you to come back right at this, having heard me say all of this. I think you could think that this gray area is a downer, and there's a better frame to cover all of our moral intuitions more reliably. And that'd be great. Right? I'd love to hear something like that. You could also think that this approach that I've taken, right, to say that here are all of our moral intuitions, let me try and find a frame to cover all of them, that approach itself is flawed. Maybe we should throw away our intuitions, right? Our intuitions are unreliable, and there's no moral problem here. The problem is with you. Okay, and then if you say something like that, you have to come up with a story of why our intuitions are unreliable, which ones to throw away, which ones to keep, and so on. But still, I think that's a fair way to object. And I'm saying all of this because I think it's more important to push the conversation forward than to adopt any one frame or the other. Right? But I think what's most important is for us to be able to articulate, to clearly talk about the moral issues of technology that we see around us. Because, well, for our own sakes, right? On the one hand, we all seem to be benefiting so much from technology. And then at the same time, we all feel like there are some serious moral problems that seem to be left unaddressed. And we want to find a way to talk about these conflicting emotions without overstating the benefits of technology or understating the problems. Right? You want to be able to talk about these things fairly. And my suggestion is that the following questions, right? Is technology taking away some freedom? Do I deserve to have this freedom in society? These questions, even if they don't get us down to the moral problem 100% of the time, they're good first questions to ask. And that's really all that I hope us hope to get across in this talk. I hope us to get us thinking about these problems and try and think about how we might account for our feelings, our moral feelings, a bit more reliably, um, so that we can have a more incisive and more productive conversation about a technological future. Thank you.